In the lesson today, we are going to be talking about statistics and their distributions. And really, this is getting at the heart of what we're trying to do when we do a statistical analysis. It's sort of given away by the fact that we're talking about statistics in a statistics class. But what we'll see today is sort of the core workflow of doing a statistical analysis. We'll talk about sort of the core components, and we'll really try to illustrate why we just spent so long talking about probability distributions, and see how this all ties back in with being able to do statistical analyses. So, the two primary objectives for the lesson today are to understand and explain sampling distributions and what they are. We also want to differentiate between sampling distributions and population distributions. To begin, I just want to make this statement, which is familiar from early on in the course, but it's worth reiterating at this point. And that's ultimately the goal of statistics is to learn information about a population using observations from a sample. That's what we're trying to do all of the time within statistics. We want to learn about a population when we can only take a sample. And today is really the first lesson that we're going to be taking where we're trying to do this. So, to sort of formalize this with a picture, we have some population that we care about, and on that population there's going to be a parameter of interest. Maybe we care about the average height of individuals, which now that we've seen distributions, we could say, is the mean of some distribution that we don't know. We might care about, the average yield from a chemical process. We might care about the number, the fairness of a coin that we've been flipping a bunch of times, right? Any number of things, any sort of result from a population that you could care about. How effective is a medical treatment? All of these things, right? So we have our population, and then there's the parameter that we care about. But we can't measure everyone in the population, or at least not normally, right? And so instead, we look at taking a sample from that population. And this sample is going to be some subset, and we hope that it's representative of the population, and we hope, that we took it according to good sampling methodologies, but we have some sample. And for the sample, we're actually collecting the data for these individual observations. And so because of that, we can compute what are known as sample statistics. We saw the sample mean, we saw the sample variance, we saw sample percentiles. All of these things can actually be computed for our sample because we have observed the data. And then our goal is to use that sample statistic to tell us something about the population parameter, right? If we take a sample of individuals, we measure all of their height so that we have the sample mean height, we want to be able to take that sample mean height and say something about the population mean height, right? And so that's the overarching process of statistics. And really the question that we're going to be trying to answer is how can we take that sample statistic and say something of interest about the population parameter? Whenever we compute a statistic from a sample, it's not generally going to equal the underlying parameter. If I compute the sample mean height from a group of people, that's not going to be exactly the same as the mean height of that same population, right? And that's because our sample is going to have sample variability in it. Because of this, we know that just reporting that sample mean is not going to be enough. It's not going to tell us everything that we need to know about that population parameter. And so what we want to do is characterize how reliable are these statistics that we're computing as proxies for those underlying parameters. If I have a group of people and I've calculated their average height, how close do I think that's going to be to the true average height? And of course, this is going to depend on all sorts of factors, right? If I just walk into my house at the end of a day and I sample the heights of everyone in that house, that's obviously not going to be a very good estimate for the average height of everyone living in the province, right? But if I go and I sort of take a random sampling of people from different regions in the province, well, then that might give us a better estimate for it. And so with statistics, what we're trying to say is how reliable do we think those estimates actually are? In order to do this, in order to talk about how reliable do we think these statistics are, we need to be able to talk about the distribution of the statistic. We need to be able to quantify uncertainty around the statistic that we've computed. And if you think about what we were doing with probability questions, it was always about quantifying how uncertain we were based on the distribution of interest, right? And so we want to do that, except we want to do that from the statistic itself. The distribution of a statistic is called a sampling distribution, right? And so we sort of have two different distributions that we're thinking about here. There's the population distribution, which we don't know, which we're trying to learn something about. Take a sample, compute a sample statistic. We're thinking about that sample statistic as being from some distribution itself. And that's a distribution that we can normally get our hands on a little bit better. And because of that, we're able to then make statements about how reliable do we think this specific version of the statistic is going to be. And the distribution of our statistic is called the sampling distribution. So to sort of make this intuitive, every single time that we're drawing from a population, that we draw a sample from a population, the statistic is going to be computed, and then it's going to be different from each of the other draws, right? There's random variation in our computation of that statistic. So if you thought about actually taking many different samples from the population of interest, and on each of those samples, you compute your statistic of interest, right? And then we could start to plot those different values over time, right? And so it's the different values from independent samples on the same population. What we start to plot there is going to be the distribution of that statistic, right? It's going to be our sampling distribution. And so if we're trying to think about what is the sampling distribution, the easiest way to think about this is to think about running our experiment many, many times. Normally we only have one sample, but what if we could take many different samples, right? So we can go back to this question that we saw, or this graphic that we saw early on in the semester. And in this, we have our population here of different colored squares. And for sake of example, let's imagine that we want to calculate the proportion of black squares that are in this sample. Okay? And so I'm telling you that 0.195 is the proportion of black squares in this sample. All right? But we don't actually know that. We don't know that parameter value. And so we want to use statistics to do it. And so maybe what we do is we take a sample of size 10, right? And on this sample of size 10, we get that the sample proportion is 0.2. Okay? And so we know, because we know the answer, well, that's a pretty good estimate. In fact, that's the best estimate we could get from a sample of size 10. But we also know that this random sample of size 10 depended on the random variation, right? And we could have sampled other times and gotten different results, right? So we have 4 samples here. In 2 of the samples, we got 0.2, and 2 of the samples, we got 0.1, right? And we could have done that many more times, right? And so here's just 16 random samples drawn from this. And you can see that sometimes, like in sample 9, we have 0 black squares represented. And sometimes we have 3 black squares represented, right? And if you were to keep doing this, you could even imagine getting a sample with even more, right? And so here we can see what we're talking about with this sampling variability. Each one of these sample proportions is sort of a random draw from the sampling distribution. Right? And we don't necessarily know exactly what that sampling distribution is, but if we were to keep repeating this experiment over and over and over again, we could end up plotting out this histogram. Right? Now, because we are dealing with samples of size 10, we can only observe these sort of discrete buckets. And so I've drawn this as a histogram here, but it's for a discrete population, right? And so you can see that over time, we're going to get different values that are possible here, right? So we have just over 0.1 proportion of the time do we observe a 0. And then, between 0.1 and 0.3 going to be the most likely. And as soon as we're up to 0.4 or above, it becomes very unlikely. Up to the point where, while it's probably more than 0 probability, it's basically impossible. And so what we have here is the result of these repeated experiments that we're drawing out in a histogram form. And so this represents the sampling distribution from drawing samples of size 10 and computing the proportion of black squares within them. Right? This is our sampling distribution. Because the statistics are being computed based on data which is random, a statistic also has to be a random variable. Right? Anytime that you have random inputs to a function, you're going to get random outputs. And a statistic is just taking in random information, computing something about it. Right? So our statistics, our sample mean, our sample proportion, the sample percentiles, all of these are random variables themselves. And the sampling distribution is just the distribution of that statistic. Okay? So it's how do we combine all of that information? That's what our distribution is going to end up being. We can also think about it arising from the repeated experiments. And I think that that's probably a slightly more natural way of thinking about it, but comes about because of the randomness in the underlying population. We can determine these distributions through what's known as simulation. Now, this isn't always going to be available to us, but what we just did, where we had our whole population and we simulated draws from it, that's a simulation study, right? And so this can be an effective tool in statistics. It comes up quite often where you're sort of making up some random data. And by doing that, you can understand what's going to happen with statistic. In this course, we're not going to rely too heavily on simulation, but I want to point it out as an alternative, again, going forward in the future. If you need to come up with a sampling distribution and it's not one of the ones that we cover, simulation may be your friend with that. So in summary, statistics are random variables, and because they're random variables, they have a distribution. We call their distribution the sampling distribution. We can use the sampling distributions to quantify the reliability of estimates, which is going to be an important part of statistical inference. And remember, we're starting from a population distribution. This is something that we don't know anything about or know very little about. We take a sample, we get a sample statistic. The idea is we can then use the sampling distribution to say something about the parameters of the population distribution. So it's really important to keep those two things separate in your brain. We're going to be relying on this for sort of all of the statistics that we do from here. And so if anything's not clear, I'd advise you to look a little bit more into the definitions here, come seek help, look at the textbook for some different examples, or start trying some of the practice problems that are there, because sampling distributions are critically important for all of the lessons to come. With that, that's everything that we wanted to talk about today, so I hope I see you all in the next lessons.